The idea of labelling is immediate and understandable. It is the idea that teachers hold in their minds an idea of how a pupil will perform and will treat the individual accordingly. To test this theory, two researchers called Jakobsen and Rosenthal did a study in 1968. They couldn't do it now because they wouldn't be able to get away with it, in the sense of no one would let anyone go into their schools and do this. What they did was they went into schools and they expanded on this theory that there is such thing as late bloomers or spurters, and the idea that certain students with certain characteristics were late developers and likely to do well if invested in at an early stage. They did a study on a number of different schools. They claim to have identified 20% of the school cohort, or 20% of any classroom, as containing these spurters or late bloomers. They informed the teachers of this and then left. Coming back 8 months later, they found that the self-fulfilling prophecy had entirely come into effect. That is, the teachers thought they were smart. They treated those students with a different focus. As a result, the students learnt more, the students got better grades, and so the teachers thought they were smart again. This Pygmalion effect, Pygmalion in the classroom is what the study's called, explains how teacher attitudes can have such a strong impact. The organisation of teaching and learning, and I'm now talking about Ray Riss, found a very similar pattern. In other words, his study on primary school showed that in the school that he was observing, there were three distinct areas or tables, one called tigers, one called cardinals, and one called clowns. Those that were expected to be academic high achievers were put on the tigers table, and those to a lesser degree able were variously put on the cardinals and then the clowns table. The material given to the tigers table was more complex, more demanding than that given on the other tables. The teacher time spent with the tiger table was considerably more positive than the other tables. The net result is the expectation of the teacher leading to differential educational outcomes. Howard Becker and the idea of the ideal pupil runs along very similar ideas. It suggests that in the teacher's mind, there is the idea of what a good pupil should look like and be like, and that they react most favourably to the ones most close to this ideal and least favourably from those further away. This might explain why that middle-class white females or Chinese or Indian females are seen perhaps as high achievers or become high achievers because the expectation of them is to perform well. Likewise, when it comes to working with either Afro-Caribbean males or white working class males, the similar negative attribution because the distance from the idea of the ideal pupil may explain those educational outcomes. Sharp and Green did a similar study, but this time they deliberately picked a very progressive school. So we're not talking about a very conservative traditional school. We're talking one of those free schools where there is an element of learning through play, experiential, a kind of Montessori school system. I don't know if you're aware of those. But even in these most progressive areas, these two researchers, Sharp and Green, demonstrated that the ideas of what conforms or what the stereotypical good student is and bad student is affected the organisation of teaching and learning. That is, those that were expected to do well were given more attention, lavished more time, persuaded to take part more. Those that did not fill the characteristics, and again, we're talking about a similar idea to that of the ideal pupil, were given compensatory play. In other words, they were told to the Wendy house and get on and play and let the clever people learn more. Again, even in this most progressive of environments, this leads to differentials or inequalities in educational outcomes. Catus and Cicero, and another two sociologists studying this area, looked at the student counsellor. Now, the student counsellor in the States is like a careers advisor, and at various grades and times, students are sent to them for advice or progression internally or progression out to work. What these two sociologists found was it wasn't the grades were not the only or the deciding factor on the type of advice given, but these stereotypes, these prejudicial ideas came into play. And what I mean by that is the same two students with the same set of grades in front of them, one white, a female and middle class, would be recommended to do higher, more challenging and given access or the keys to those well-paid jobs. Those Afro-Caribbean or Afro-American in the case of this study, males were, even if they had the same grades, were suggested to do sports courses, were suggested to do mechanics, and were driven in a different direction. Thus, educational outcomes were prejudiced by the internal workings of the minds of these counsellors. As a response to this labelling process, so the point is, they're labelled. If they don't, they can't successfully resist the label, they will then live up to the label, and education outcomes will follow. Now, streaming, and here's my textbook, or a mock-up of my textbook when I was a very young man. When I was at school, when I progressed from primary school to secondary school, I was put in the lowest class possible. That perhaps is because, it will surprise you to know, I was rather a plump individual. I wore glasses, was cross-eyed, and did not look like an ideal candidate. Now, when I went from primary school to secondary school, I was put in the lowest of all classes and streams based on the reports of my primary school teachers. That summer, I had an operation on my eye. I had my eyes straightened and lost the glasses. Within a term of being at secondary school, I got promoted to other sets. Now, streaming is that idea, isn't it? Streaming is the idea we're all given certain sets for maths, English in particular, sometimes for French, and they are based on the assumptions and ideas of teachers as well as their marked work. And studies have shown that prejudice, or this idea of who should be rather than the actual results, making a difference to outcomes. Likewise, as you may be taking your exams at the moment, tiers exist in which level of GCSE to take. In this case, what I'm pointing out here, this is a higher tier paper. You'll see that it's marked there. Studies have shown, and I have personal experiences, I've taught a GCSE sociology class, and I was asked to put the group either into higher or lower tier just on my assessment, on my personal assessment of them. So I do have personal experience of how this works. It has been shown that ethnic minorities, and again, particularly Afro-Caribbean minorities and boys, have overwhelmingly been put for lower tier, giving them no chance to access the higher grades. The response to this labelling can be varied. The self-saboteuring class clown can be seen as a response to negative labelling, because if you're labelled negatively, why not make the class like? Why not find another way of giving yourself self-esteem and pride? Why not find an alternative route to status? Or affect that to school, call for school kind of exterior. I don't care about school, kind of school doesn't care about me. This anti-school stance can be cool, can gain friends, can gain peers, can lead to the development of subcultures, goths, emos, punks, casuals. They've had so many names, surfer dudes, over the years going through. Cliques, groups of individuals who dress the same in order to have a different form of status and identity to that of loser, failure, academically unsuccessful, which the labelling would have adhered. Now, the outcome is the same, isn't it? Because the self-fulfilling prophecy is echoed, is amplified by this process, so that prejudice of teachers leads to rebellion against the school values, and in turn, further failure in the exam system. Again, this may explain why working class kids or kids from various ethnic minorities do worse in school than their peers. An example of this approach, but this time looking at anti-school pro-attainment subcultural groups. Two studies. One, Mary Fuller did a study amongst comprehensive scales in Camden, and found that in reaction to the negative or racist overtones of certain teachers, they would go out of their way to ignore them, to not engage in their lesson, to sit at the back and not do anything. However, they still wanted those exams, so they relied on their hard work using textbooks independently from their teaching and learning and the unbiased nature of the exam system. And they were a group. Another sociologist did another study, someone called Heidi Mirza. However, her study came to a slightly different conclusion, having looked at the same phenomenon, which was that this tactic did not work, and that these anti-school pro-achievement just led to underachievement. Tony Sewell, who is someone who's very focused on the reasons why Afro-Caribbean males in particular are being failed by the educational system, points out that he identifies 4 different forms of subcultural groups and the length to which they are pro or against educational values and conforming to, and his study further exemplifies why that Afro-Caribbean males can be seen to be failed by the system.